Thank you so much, Alistair. Kathy, it's wonderful to be here with you.
It is so good to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's fantastic. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. For everyone listening, Kathy and I have known each other for several years in the responsible AI or ethical AI space. Kathy is one of the first people I met who was deeply involved in trying to operationalize AI ethics into an organization, in her case, Salesforce. She's been doing this for several years, starting as a team of one and now growing to a slightly larger but still small team. Kathy, so much has happened in the last few years around AI ethics. It started out as this kind of exotic topic where you would mention it and people would sort of back away. And then it became, more and more common to see stories in the news about things where AI would gone wrong. I think for a while I had a spreadsheet I called AI Run Wild, where we would start to look at some of the different things that were happening in computer vision or natural language. You've seen a lot of change in the last 5 years. Can you just what's your perspective on where we are I wouldn't call us an industry, but as a practice today?
Yeah, I think as just like you, Susan, as I started meeting more and more people in this field, I found that the responsible AI or ethical AI teams that were created at companies like Google and Microsoft and Intel and elsewhere, oftentimes they were individuals like myself that started asking questions about not just can we do this, but should we do this? And leveraging the research that was being done by so many of the brilliant individuals that were out there, Deborah Johnny, Ruha Benjamin, of course, Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell, and all of those others, reading all of these papers and seeing the headlines and seeing the things that were going on and looking internally and saying, how do we make sure that we're not doing the same thing here? And so being able to grow entire teams dedicated to asking these questions and then also proliferating out throughout the company. So we do have a pretty small centralized team, but we're so blessed that we get to work with other people in different roles at the company that have similar concerns of ensuring that what they are doing is responsible. And now, as I talk to Salesforce customers, they are actively thinking about how do they build an ethical AI practice in their company. So even if there isn't somebody like an individual contributor raising their hand saying, hey, we need to think about this. Now at the executive level, a lot of companies are proactively saying, we need this discipline in our company as well. And so starting to create teams in a much more formalized, perhaps less organic way, but nevertheless, looking to people that have years of experience doing this and trying to say, okay, how do we do this well?
Yeah, and what's so interesting to me about this work is that there isn't really a template out there. There hasn't been a template out there. I mean, I'm really glad that you brought up the names of some of these incredible scholars, many of which are women, most of which are people of color. People like Ruha Benjamin and Safiya Noble, the people who have looked at, for example, the way that technology systems reinforce societal biases, or the way that search reinforces bias. Who have looked at AI and sort of the specific kind of attributes of AI that make it really difficult to understand how decisions are made, who want to add additional transparency and who want to make sure that the systems that we build don't simply replicate and reinforce the systems in which we live, right? Because we have to make some choices. And I think, given that we have, that we work within a realm where we could not do what we do if not for that academic scholarship, there isn't really a sort of natural way of building a team. And I think everyone I've spoken to who's had a role in some way related to the responsible use of AI and data has had to kind of figure it out. So can you talk a little bit about your own journey and sort of how it started and, as the meme goes, how it started and how it's going?
Yeah, I had to say it's just been such a blessing that there have been really wonderful, generous individuals that started doing this work a long time ago that were willing to give their time and share their expertise as to what they had learned along the way. Salesforce didn't really become an AI first company until around 2016. Microsoft, IBM, Intel, Google had obviously been doing this for a long time before that, and so being able to reach out to individuals like Jen Janai and Mira Lane and Tim O'Brien and Kush Varshney, and there's a million names that I want to say right now, and I'm scared to death of leaving out any of them. And of course, people like yourself that worked in the role of analyst and had experience talking to so many other companies, being able to come together and have conversations and learning from each other along the way was so important about how do we talk about the business value of doing this. I don't think any of us ever really encounter individuals in our company. They're like, ethics, schmethics, who cares? It's all about the money. But there are always these trade-offs
Yeah.
that happen of this sounds great. I would love to do what you're recommending, but I also have these other demands that I am accountable for. How do I, square this circle? How do I figure out how to make these very tough decisions? And so again, being able to leverage other individuals in the company and companies doing something similar has been very helpful. And I think, again, being able to read papers that have been published in FACT, the Fairness, Accountable Transparency Conference, or AIES, AI Ethics and Society conferences, to figure out how do we look for different kinds of bias. See what kind of data sets that are open source that have been used so commonly, and finding that other researchers have done the analysis and found bias that are in those data sets. And so we don't have to do that ourselves. We can look at these papers and we know, hey, if you're going to use this particular data set, we know going in it's biased. What are we going to do about it?
Right. Yeah, I saw, I've seen certainly a lot of conversations on Twitter about, how we build safety mechanisms, and certainly many papers being written on how we build safety mechanisms, how we convince people to behave differently. Now, you and I both work for large technology companies, so we sit in a very specific place. If you look at the work, for example, of, people who have been in this field doing, the actual kind of practitioner work, like Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell and various other folks at companies like Amazon and Facebook and Twitter, Ruman Chowdhury over at Twitter and various other folks. Everybody's focused on slightly different issues because they have slightly different business models. Certainly the issues of a Facebook or a Twitter are very different from the issues of a Salesforce or a Microsoft. And then all of those are different from the issues of a government agency or a policymaker who is trying to look across the sort of vast sweep of technology and make decisions. And so I guess the thing that leads me to is, where can we start to try to create more of a kind of common denominator to talk about this stuff, right? Because issues like fairness, issues like public good, even issues around, the benefit of organizations versus society are very subjective. So let's talk a little bit about the fundamental issues that we see, that you see, when you look at the sort of ethics of artificial intelligence.
I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is we can do all kinds of bias and fairness analysis of our models and compare it against a training data set. And we may even have some fantastic evaluation data sets to see how does this stand up? What are the disparate impact scores? What are the F1 accuracy or performance scores? But it's not until something gets actually out in the wild, so to speak, that we see what the impact is. And so, we've got numbers for the accuracy of facial recognition systems, but you wouldn't be able to take that number and extrapolate from that. Okay, this probably is going to result in X number of innocent Black men being arrested because they were wrongly identified by facial recognition. And so, how do we try to figure out what safe means? How do we monitor how that technology is actually being applied to humans? Because debiasing data sets or models is one important step, but it's not the step that's going to ensure that an AI is applied equally and fairly to all populations. And if a lot of proposed regulations rely on individuals reporting, raising their hand saying, hey, I was harmed by an AI system. They may not even know that an AI was involved. How do they report that they were treated unfairly? And so those are some of the really hard problems that I think we're trying to figure out as we are trying to implement AI responsibly in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point, because when you look at sort of the way that we think about safety, for example, car safety, if I'm driving a car and the car has a flaw and I get into an accident, it's very clear what the chain of events was, right? If I am sitting on, your social media site of choice, and I don't see an ad for a role that I would like to apply for at a company, I have no way of knowing that. If I'm not approved for a loan, I have no way of knowing that. I mean, I know I wasn't approved, but I don't know what the decision was. There was a story, I think it was Apple related story a few years ago about, husband and wife, husband applies, gets it, wife applies, doesn't get it. There are stories like that out there in the world. But yes, this question of, how do we understand the sort of second and third order effects, and how do you even prove the negative is really hard. Let's talk a little bit about this issue around explainability or interpretability, and let's do this in, really kind of basic language, in a if-then kind of classic programming model. It's, it's a syllogism, right? If A, then B. If B, then C, and you can go on in a branching structure forever and ever. And so you can trace that back. You have an audit trail to know what happened. Algorithms, machine learning algorithms, or at least let's think about, AI algorithms, don't work that way. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you may be able to see for an algorithm what are the primary factors in a model. So if it's trying to decide, is someone a good candidate to repay a loan, you may see that income is a number one predictor. Their credit history previously with that bank, collateral they have, those are all common sense. But you could also see that the model is picking up on the candidate's race or gender or age, and that's not legal. So if you see that those are primary factors in the model, then you can go in and do something about it. Sometimes there are proxy variables like zip code, which can be a proxy for race in the US. But there are other times where it's just not clear how an AI is making that decision. And so you need not only to understand what is the underlying decision making, but it also has to be communicated back to the person in a way that they can understand, which is going to be very different if you're an AI developer trying to debug, or if you're an auditor trying to see is a law being broken, or if you are a customer service rep or a sales rep and you want to understand why is this particular product being recommended, why was this particular individual being denied a loan. And so that's where the difference between explainability and interpretability comes in. And with some of the AI models, deep neural networks, it can be very difficult to communicate why is the AI making the prediction or the recommendation that it is.
Mm-hmm. And it's not really just AI's fault, let's be honest, right? Because a lot of these so-called predictive attributes are things that are nested in so much history, so much social history and economic history and political history, that the person who can't pay back the loan, who lives in a particular postal code, you know, or the person who doesn't have a positive health outcome because they can't get to the hospital, those things are not necessarily captured, at least explicitly captured. And so I think, you know, one of the things that I find really important is for us to never forget that artificial intelligence is just an abstraction of everyday human life. And when we turn people into, you know, equations, we're going to lose things. So that's, I think a good transition to talk about, you know, we've talked about what's challenging. Let's talk about what's possible. In your job every day, you have to make tons of decisions about, you know, what can we do from a practical standpoint? And then what should we be doing from a cultural standpoint to sort of change the dialogue, change the way we think about things? So can you talk about those two things and sort of how you balance them?
At Salesforce, we are in a very different position from many B2C companies. We are a platform. And so we provide foundational models to our customers, but then those models get fine-tuned with the customer's data, and we can't see our customers' data. And so if someone is using our AI in a way that's not responsible, not ethical, or maybe they're just not even aware, we are constantly thinking about how do we provide in-app guidance or training or better ways of helping our customers understand how to use that AI responsibly. And that's really hard to do when you can't see what's happening with a customer's model or their data set. And so we're regularly having conversations with product teams about what is our process for developing AI. If how do we make sure that this is explainable and interpretable to customers so that they know what the right thing is that they should be doing?
And so, you know, as I said, we both work for large technology companies, but also we both live in society. We both are, you know, we both use healthcare. We both have financial lives. We have, you know, children who have educational futures, and we live in this world where data is all around us, where more and more algorithms are determining, you know, lots of things about our lives. And so, you know, I think, you know, I don't envy the policymaker in terms of trying to find, you know, his or her way around all of this. At the same time, I think it's important to think about, you know, clearly, you know, there's regulation in the offing, what it will look like, when it will happen, where it will happen. All these things are open to question. At the same time, we have companies such as Salesforce and Microsoft and others who are trying to prepare for a different kind of world and trying to kind of help the evolution of these technologies along. What do you have advice, you know, for policymakers? What should they be thinking about? What kinds of conversations, you know, have you had that you think have been fruitful?
This is the more I spend time reading through proposed and draft regulation and digging down into the details, the more and more difficult it is becoming to come up with regulation that is clear, that it's not such a broad definition of AI, for example, that it includes Excel macros or if this, then that statements, that we also are able to have some level of standard that we know what is safe. And so we can't say that data sets or models must be 100% bias free, because that's not possible. That's not realistic. If you have a model that your analysis shows is 100% bias free, it's probably overfitting, probably not a good model. The best that we can say is, here's how we looked for bias. Here are the definitions of bias that we looked for.
Mhm.
And here's the score that we got, how we measured it. And here's what we did to try and improve it. And at what point do you say, okay, this is safe enough to expose to the public? And again, coming back to the real world implications, how do we put those opportunities for redress and remediation in place so that humans don't have to constantly be on the lookout and be solely responsible for protecting themselves from harmful AI? One point that I think can touch on a number of different things that you and I have talked about in these last few minutes is Twitter did an ethics bug bounty that I absolutely loved. And
Just explain what an ethics bug bounty is for people who might not know.
yeah, so for some of you may be familiar with bug bounties. A lot of companies have them. You have individuals that may try to hack a system, but not with ill intent, but then to file a bug, raise awareness of that company that here's a security flaw that you have, and they will get a bounty for that, because this is in the best interest of the company
Mhm.
to be made aware of flaws that they didn't know about. Oftentimes, teams try to do this themselves through red teaming. So they're trying to basically hack themselves, or penetration testing, things like that. Ethics bug bounties is then having individuals then find all of the ethical flaws or harms from this system. And so they did it with their image cropping algorithm, and they were able to find, they already had some reports of the AI cropping out people's heads based on their skin tone or other attributes. It wasn't being done correctly for everyone. And once they opened it up, all of these other individuals started reporting other factors that the system was biased against when deciding how to crop an image. And so that is something that I think is so powerful, is giving tools, giving the opportunity for the public to come in and use the diversity of lived experiences, and bring that back and have a forum for the public to say to the company, here is how your product does not work for me. And
Mhm.
I'm a huge fan of that work, and I hope more and more companies will replicate that.
Yeah, as I hear you talking, I really think a lot about, what are the models that we have out in the world that can help us deal with the complexities of artificial intelligence and, whatever intelligent technologies are coming down the pike that we haven't even thought of yet. When you talk about safety, clearly we have thresholds of safety in consumer products. We have thresholds of, particles that can be included, or, in the air. We have, in terms of, manufacturing, and in terms of consumer products, we have thresholds of how they can be made. And, in terms of drugs, we have thresholds and around things like unanticipated adverse effects and things like that. And really, all of these came about because we learned over time, the behavior of these products, the behavior of these systems. We learned, from the early part of the 20th century. At a certain point, we became very clear that we needed seatbelts in cars because people were driving much faster on much wider roadways than they were before, and accidents could be much more severe, much more life-threatening. In some ways, that's great news, right?
Yep.
Because we have models from which to learn. On the other hand, it's bad news because we don't want to wait 100 years, right?
Yeah.
And so we have an opportunity now. And, you know, back to one of the points that you made earlier about you can't have an entirely bias-free system. You know, maybe theoretically at a precise moment in time, you could optimize your algorithm for that thing, for the thing that all the people in the room care about, right? Whether that's equity, whether that's diversity, whatever that may be, right? But then it's going to be trained on new data and new data. This is the native behavior of algorithms. They're
Yeah.
always changing. You can never step in the same algorithm twice.
Yeah.
So it seems like what we're getting toward is this idea that we all have to uplift our own understanding of how these technologies work. So I guess what that leads me to is my last question for you, which is around, you know, as you survey, let's say your last 3, 4, 5 years doing this kind of work, and you look out at the next 3, 4, 5 years, what are your personal priorities? What would you like to see happen in the world?
Yeah, I want to give a huge shout out to Madeline Claire Ellis. She coined this term, moral crumple zones. We are we're the crumple zones in a car, speaking in safety terms, where we're having this AI experimented on us in real time. It's, again, just keep coming back over and over again to it being difficult for us to predict, based solely on bias metrics, how a system could hurt individuals in society once this is released. But a failure of imagination is not an excuse.
Right.
And so I think this is the piece that we really have to invest all of ourselves in moving forward, of what are those seatbelts? What are those airbags that we need to be putting in place, because things are going to happen. The cat that runs across the road that you didn't see. There are just all of these things that are going to happen. We know that no AI system can be perfect, but we've got to design it in ways that when those bad things happen, we catch it and we are able to blunt the majority of the harm from hurting the individual, and then we learn from it. I don't think we're doing enough learning. I've got this redonkulous list of headlines that come out about AI, so similar to the spreadsheet that you had, and it just seems like the industry isn't learning, because so many of the headlines are similar, but you just exchange different company names. So we're not learning from prior harms that have happened, and we've got to get better at that. And whether regulation is able to help do that or not, I would like to hope that it can. But regardless, as a society, we have to demand that we've got better tracking mechanisms, and much better safety mechanisms when we get it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing that was implicit in what you said is, in order for us to see the effects, we have to have the diversity of people in
Yeah.
the room, not only to detect the outcomes, but to predict those outcomes before they happen. And that's why, heterogeneous teams, diverse teams, inclusive teams are absolutely critical. And then I think the other thing implicit in what you said around learning is humility, is just realizing that there's an awesome power to these technologies for tremendous amounts of good in the world, but they're incredibly powerful, and we have to treat them with respect.
Yeah,
So
and it shouldn't be implicit. I shouldn't imply the criticality of diversity. That has to be
yeah.
explicitly
Well, I know
stated.
you know that. I know you know that. I just want to put a point on it. So, Kathy, this has been so much fun. I hope next time we can do it in person.
Yes.
And thank you so much for sharing your insights and having this chat. And Alistair, back to you.